Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. In the winter of 2009, a Tokyo municipal worker named Kenji Watanabe received an assignment that would change his life forever. He was told to verify property records for a mansion near Shinjuku that had somehow disappeared from the city's digital mapping system. The building existed in old archives, but had been systematically erased from modern databases. When Kenji asked his supervisor why, the older man simply looked at him with tired eyes and said the address should never have been recorded in the first place. That response should have been warning enough, but Kenji was young, ambitious, and believed that bureaucratic mysteries always had rational explanations. He had no idea that some places are removed from maps, not because they've been forgotten, but because remembering them is dangerous. The Himuro mansion sat behind a wall of overgrown bamboo on a street that seemed to exist in a pocket of perpetual twilight. Kenji found it on his third attempt, after his GPS failed twice and sent him in circles around the same residential blocks. The neighborhood around it was oddly quiet for Tokyo, with none of the usual ambient noise of traffic or construction. Houses nearby looked occupied but felt abandoned, their windows dark even in early afternoon. The mansion itself was a traditional wooden structure, 3 stories tall, with a distinctive sloped roof that had partly collapsed on the eastern side. A heavy chain and industrial padlock secured the front gate, and behind it, the entrance was covered with overlapping strips of yellowed paper talismans, their ink faded but still visible. Kenji photographed the exterior, noting the unusual number of wards, far more than he'd seen on any condemned building before. He counted 23 separate papers on the door alone, each one covered in kanji characters he didn't recognize. When he checked his photos later, he noticed something odd. In every image, there was a blur near the upper floor windows, a smear of darkness that looked almost like a face pressed against the glass. He assumed it was a reflection or camera malfunction and deleted them, planning to return with better equipment. The municipal archives revealed more questions than answers. The Himuro family had owned the property since the late 1800s, but all records ended abruptly in 1952. There were no death certificates, no property transfers, no tax documents after that year. Just a handwritten note in the margin of the last file that read, "Sealed by order of the Health Ministry, investigation ongoing." Kenji found a newspaper clipping from 1953, barely legible, describing a disturbance at the mansion that had required police intervention. The article mentioned rope marks and unusual staining, but provided no details about victims or arrests. A second clipping, dated a week later, announced that the investigation had been closed and the property condemned for structural reasons. The official explanation felt hollow. Kenji had inspected dozens of condemned buildings, and none of them had generated sealed government files or required health ministry involvement. When he requested the original investigation reports, he was told they'd been lost in a fire in 1971. When he asked to speak with anyone who might remember the case, his supervisor called him into a closed-door meeting and suggested, very politely, that he focus on his other assignments. The mansion, he was told, had already been inspected and documented. There was no need to pursue it further. But Kenji had seen the photographs on file. They were grainy, black and white, and clearly taken in the 1,950 seconds. They showed an empty house with furniture covered in dust, They showed nothing that would justify the level of official secrecy. That night, he made a decision that would haunt him for years. He would inspect the mansion himself after hours and document whatever was inside. He told himself he was being thorough, following protocol. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. He was curious, and curiosity had always been his weakness. Kenji returned to the Himuro mansion on a Thursday evening in late November. He brought a flashlight, a camera, a crowbar for the padlock, and a sense of professional duty that felt increasingly fragile as he approached the front gate. The street was even quieter than before, the kind of silence that feels unnatural in a city of millions. He noticed that the neighboring houses still showed no signs of life, no lights, no sounds, no movement behind curtains. The air smelled faintly of incense and something else, something organic and unpleasant, that reminded him of old meat left in a closed room. He cut the padlock with bolt cutters and pushed open the gate. It scraped against the ground with a sound that seemed too loud, too violent in the stillness. The talismans on the front door were brittle with age, and they tore easily when he pulled them away. Underneath, the wood was covered in scratch marks, hundreds of them, gouged deep into the grain in vertical lines, as if someone had clawed at the door from the inside. Kenji ran his fingers over the marks and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The scratches were too uniform, too deliberate. They formed patterns, repeating symbols that looked almost like kanji but weren't quite right. He took photos, noting the way the marks seemed to concentrate around the lock and hinges. Then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit him immediately, stronger now, a thick, rotting sweetness mixed with incense and old paper. The entrance hall was narrow and dark, lined with empty alcoves where family shrines would have stood. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading deeper into the house. They were small, child-sized, and they disappeared around a corner into what looked like a sitting room. Kenji followed them, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and that's when he noticed the ropes. They hung from the ceiling beams throughout the first floor, dozens of them, thick hemp ropes tied in elaborate knots and left to dangle about 6 feet from the ground. Some were frayed at the ends, others looked almost new despite the decades of abandonment. Kenji moved through the room slowly, documenting each rope, trying to make sense of the pattern. They seemed to form a grid, dividing the space into sections, with the highest concentration in the central hall. Beneath each rope, the floor was stained dark, circular patches that looked disturbingly like dried blood. He knelt beside one and scraped at it with his fingernail. The stain was deep, soaked into the wood, and when he smelled his finger, the metallic scent was unmistakable. He stood quickly, his heart racing, and tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Animal sacrifice, he thought, some kind of ritual that went wrong. But the scale was overwhelming. There were at least 30 ropes on the first floor alone, and every single one had a corresponding stain beneath it. He moved toward the staircase, drawn by a sound he couldn't quite identify, a faint rhythmic creaking that seemed to come from the floor above. As he climbed, he noticed that the walls were covered in more of those strange symbols, carved directly into the plaster in long vertical lines. The second floor was colder than the first, and the smell was stronger. The creaking sound grew louder, more distinct, and Kenji realized with growing dread that it was the sound of rope stretching under weight. He turned the corner into a long hallway and froze. At the far end, barely visible in the beam of his flashlight, a figure hung from one of the ceiling ropes. It was motionless, swaying slightly, and even from a distance Kenji could see that it was wearing traditional white funeral clothing. He took a step backward, his mind screaming at him to leave, but his body refused to move. The figure turned its head, slowly, impossibly, and looked directly at him. Its face was covered by a white cloth mask, but through the fabric, Kenji could see the dark, hollow spaces where eyes should have been. He ran. He doesn't remember making the decision, only the sensation of his legs moving, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stumbled down the stairs and through the sitting room. Behind him, he heard footsteps, light and quick, and the sound of ropes snapping taut. He burst through the front door and kept running until he reached his car 3 blocks away. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. When he finally drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but empty street. But the smell remained, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his skin. That night, he developed the photos he'd taken. Most were unusable, filled with strange light artifacts and shadows that seemed to move between frames. But one image was crystal clear. It showed the hallway on the 2nd floor, and in the background, partially visible through a doorway, were more figures. They hung in rows, dozens of them, all wearing white, all perfectly still. Kenji counted them twice, trying to match the number to the ropes he'd seen on the 1st floor. There were 47 figures in the photograph. He had counted 30 ropes. The math didn't work, and that terrified him more than anything else. The next morning, he submitted his report. He described the mansion as structurally unstable and recommended immediate demolition. He made no mention of the ropes, the stains, or the figures. He simply noted evidence of historical occupancy and significant biohazard concerns, and filed it away. His supervisor accepted the report without comment and reassigned him to a different district. Kenji never returned to Shinjuku, and he never spoke about what he saw in the Himuro mansion. But the story doesn't end with Kenji's silence. In the weeks following his visit, he began experiencing vivid nightmares, always the same scene. He was standing in the mansion's central hall, surrounded by those hanging ropes, and one by one, figures would descend from the ceiling and land softly on the floor around him. They never spoke, never moved toward him, but their presence was suffocating. He would wake up gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat, and the smell of incense and decay would linger in his bedroom for hours. He tried to rationalize it as trauma, as his mind processing what he'd seen, but the dreams grew more detailed with each occurrence. He started noticing things he hadn't consciously observed during his visit, small details that suggested the mansion had been the site of something far worse than he'd imagined. In his dreams, he could see the symbols on the walls clearly now, and he recognized them. They were binding wards meant to trap something, to keep it contained within the house. But the wards were incomplete, broken in places, as if whatever ritual they were part of had been interrupted or deliberately sabotaged. A colleague who specialized in historical documentation told him, off the record, that the Himuro family had been practitioners of a particularly extreme form of purification ritual. They believed that human sacrifice, performed with absolute precision and willing participants, could create a barrier against malevolent spirits. The ritual required 49 participants, all family members, who would voluntarily hang themselves in a specific sequence over the course of 7 days. The mansion was supposed to become a permanent seal, a place where darkness was locked away forever. But according to the fragmentary records that survived, something went wrong on the final day. The last 2 participants refused to complete the ritual, and instead of creating a seal, the family opened a doorway. What came through that doorway was never documented, but the government's response was swift and absolute. The mansion was sealed, The surviving family members disappeared, and all records were classified or destroyed. Kenji realized, with a sickening certainty, that the figures he'd seen in the hallway weren't decorations or remnants of the past. They were the family members who had completed the ritual, still hanging, still waiting for the final 2 sacrifices that would close the door they'd opened. The dreams stopped suddenly 3 months later, replaced by something worse. Kenji began seeing the white-clad figures in his waking life, always at a distance, always watching. He'd catch glimpses of them in crowded subway stations, standing perfectly still while everyone else moved around them. He'd see them in the windows of buildings he passed, their masked faces turned toward him. He consulted a doctor who prescribed medication for anxiety and stress-related hallucinations, but the pills did nothing. The figures grew more frequent, more bold, and Kenji understood that he'd broken a boundary that should never have been crossed. By entering the mansion, by documenting what he'd found, he'd drawn their attention. He'd become part of their unfinished ritual, a potential candidate for the sacrifice that was still owed. In desperation, he sought out a Shinto priest who specialized in purification rites. The priest listened to his story with a grave expression and then told him something that made his blood run cold. The Himuro ritual couldn't be undone, but it could be transferred. If Kenji could find someone else to enter the mansion, someone who would willingly cross the threshold and document what they found, the attention of the bound spirits would shift to that person instead. The priest made it clear that this wasn't a solution, merely a temporary reprieve, but Kenji was beyond caring about morality. He was terrified, exhausted, and willing to do anything to make the visions stop. He never acted on the priest's advice, but the knowledge that he could, that he had that option, changed something fundamental in his character. He became withdrawn, paranoid, unable to form close relationships because he feared what he might do to save himself. Years passed, and Kenji left Tokyo entirely, moving to a small town in Hokkaido where no one knew his history. The visions faded to occasional glimpses, manageable if not entirely gone, and he convinced himself that distance had weakened whatever connection he'd formed with the mansion. But in 2017, he received a phone call from his former supervisor in Tokyo. The Himuro mansion had been sold to a development company. Despite decades of official resistance, someone with enough money and political connections had successfully pushed through the permits for demolition and redevelopment. The supervisor wanted to warn Kenji because his name was still on file as the last official inspector. If anything went wrong during demolition, if any remains were found or accidents occurred, Kenji might be called to testify about his findings. He assured the supervisor that his report had been thorough and accurate, but after hanging up, he felt a creeping sense of dread. The demolition was scheduled for the following month. Kenji didn't sleep the night before it was supposed to happen. He stayed up watching news feeds and checking social media for any reports from Shinjuku. The demolition was delayed twice due to equipment malfunctions, then postponed indefinitely when 3 workers were hospitalized with severe respiratory distress after entering the building to set charges. The development company released a statement blaming mold and toxic building materials, but Kenji knew better. The mansion was still protecting itself, still maintaining the incomplete seal that held whatever darkness the Himuro family had summoned. A week later, the government quietly repurchased the property and added it to a list of cultural heritage sites that required special preservation. No public announcement was made, no explanation given for the sudden reversal. The mansion was resealed, this time with modern chains and warning signs about structural instability. But Kenji found something else when he dug deeper into the news archives. During the brief period when workers had been inside, one of them had taken photographs. The images were leaked online before being scrubbed from most platforms, but Kenji managed to find copies on an obscure forum. They showed the interior of the mansion, mostly unchanged from his visit 8 years earlier. But in one photograph, taken in the central hall, the ropes were occupied. Every single one had a figure hanging from it, 47 in total, all wearing white funeral garments, all facing the camera. And standing in the foreground, clear and unmistakable, was a 48th figure. It wore modern clothes, jeans, and a work jacket, and its face was visible. Kenji recognized the man. It was one of the workers who had been hospitalized. He died 3 days after the photo was taken, officially from complications related to toxic exposure. But the hospital staff who treated him reported that he'd been in a state of constant terror, screaming about ropes and white faces and unfinished rituals. The mansion remains sealed today. The city has removed it from all digital maps again, and the street address has been officially retired. Local residents avoid the area, and those who live nearby report hearing sounds at night, rhythmic, creaking, and faint chanting that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Kenji still lives in Hokkaido, and he still sees the figures occasionally, always at a distance, always watching. He knows now that there's no escape, no transfer of burden, no redemption. He's part of the mansion's story, bound to it by the simple act of witnessing, and someday, when his time comes, he'll return to that central hall and take his place among the hanging figures, the 49th participant in a ritual that will never be completed. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The horror of places that refuse to die, that cling to our world through tragedy and ritual, is a uniquely Asian phenomenon. But sometimes, the terror isn't confined to walls and rooms. Sometimes, it stretches across miles of dark asphalt, waiting for travelers who don't know they're already marked. In Malaysia, on a highway that connects the capital to the coast, there's a tunnel where the dead don't rest, and every driver who passes through carries a piece of the darkness with them. This is what happened on the Karak highway, and why the government will never tell you the whole truth about Tunnel 13. Detective Inspector Rashid Ahmad had driven the Karak highway hundreds of times in his 20-year career with the Royal Malaysia Police. The route from Kuala Lumpur to the east coast was essential for both commercial and personal travel, a vital artery that cut through the Titiwangsa Mountains and reduced what would have been a 6-hour journey to just over 2 hours. The highway was well-maintained, modern, and generally safe, which made the accident statistics for one particular section increasingly difficult to explain. Between 2005 and 2012, there were 47 fatal crashes in and around Tunnel 13, a short passage through the mountain about halfway along the route. The number was staggering compared to other sections of the highway, and what made it more disturbing was the consistency of witness reports. Survivors and witnesses consistently described seeing a child on the road seconds before impact, a pale figure standing motionless in the middle of the lane, visible only in the final moments before collision. Rashid had dismissed these reports for years as the brain's attempt to rationalize sudden accidents, the mind creating false memories to explain the unexplainable. But in early 2013, dashcam footage from a fatal crash changed everything. The video was clear, time-stamped, and impossible to explain away. The footage came from a truck driver named Hamza bin Ismail, who had died instantly when his vehicle swerved off the road at high speed and struck the tunnel wall. The dashcam captured everything. The road ahead was empty, well lit by the truck's headlights and the tunnel's overhead lighting. Then, approximately 50 meters from the tunnel entrance, a figure appeared in the center of the lane. It didn't walk into frame or emerge from the shadows. It was simply there, as if it had materialized from the asphalt itself. The figure was a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, wearing a white shirt and dark shorts, common clothing for Malaysian school children. The child stood perfectly still, facing the oncoming truck, and made no attempt to move or escape. Hamza had less than 3 seconds to react. The dashcam caught his desperate attempt to swerve, the truck lurching to the left, but physics and momentum made evasion impossible at that speed. The truck passed through the space where the child stood, but there was no impact, no sound of collision, nothing to indicate contact with a physical body. Yet Hamza continued his swerve, overcompensating, and the truck slammed into the concrete wall with enough force to crumple the cab entirely. When Rashid first watched the footage, he assumed it was a technical glitch, a visual artifact caused by headlight reflection or camera malfunction. But the Ministry of Transport's Technical Division analyzed the video frame by frame and found no evidence of manipulation or equipment failure. The child figure appeared in 12 consecutive frames, clearly defined, and then vanished in the 13th frame without any transitional blur or fade. The report noted, in very careful language, that the figure displayed optical characteristics inconsistent with known photographic anomalies, and recommended further investigation into environmental factors affecting driver perception. That clinical phrasing couldn't hide the underlying reality. The people who studied this footage couldn't explain what they were seeing, and that terrified them. Rashid was assigned to lead a comprehensive investigation into the tunnel and its accident history. He assembled a team of 4 officers and a civilian consultant, an engineer named Priya who specialized in road safety. Their first task was to review every accident report associated with Tunnel 13 over the past decade. What emerged was a pattern that became more disturbing the deeper they dug. Of the 47 fatal crashes, 32 involved drivers reporting a child on the road immediately before impact. 9 additional crashes involved single-vehicle collisions where the driver, if they survived, claimed they'd swerved to avoid hitting someone, even though no pedestrian was ever found. The remaining 6 crashes had no witnesses and no survivors, but in 4 of those cases, skid marks indicated sudden, violent, evasive maneuvers inconsistent with normal driving conditions. Priya pointed out that the tunnel itself was structurally sound, well lit, and properly maintained. There were no design flaws, no unusual grades or curves that would explain the accident frequency. The weather during most incidents was clear and dry. The time of day varied widely, ruling out factors like sun glare or poor visibility. Every rational explanation they tested led nowhere. Then they found the medical records. 8 drivers who had survived crashes in Tunnel 13 were treated at local hospitals for severe psychological distress following their accidents. All 8 described the same experience. They had seen a child on the road, attempted to avoid collision, and then, in the moments before or after impact, they had made eye contact with the child's face. Every single one of them described the same features: pale skin, dark eyes that seemed too large, and a complete absence of expression. Several noted that the child's mouth appeared to be moving, as if speaking or chanting, but no sound accompanied the movement. 2 of the survivors developed acute insomnia and paranoid delusions within days of their accidents. One committed suicide 6 months later, leaving a note that simply read, "It follows me home every night." Another disappeared entirely, abandoning his family and career, and was never located despite an extensive search. The medical professionals who treated these patients noted unusual consistency in their hallucinations and recommended psychiatric evaluation. But none of the patients agreed to long-term treatment. They simply wanted to forget, to move on, to never discuss what they'd experienced. Rashid decided the team needed to examine the tunnel at night, when most of the fatal accidents had occurred. They arrived at midnight on a Thursday in March, setting up equipment to monitor traffic and record any unusual activity. The tunnel was approximately 300 meters long, cutting through solid granite, and featured 2 lanes in each direction, separated by a low concrete barrier. Overhead lights illuminated the space at regular intervals, creating pools of harsh white light interspersed with stretches of relative shadow. Traffic was light at this hour, with vehicles passing through every few minutes, their engines echoing off the tunnel walls. The team split up, positioning themselves at both ends and in the middle of the tunnel, maintaining radio contact. For the first hour, nothing unusual occurred. Vehicles passed through without incident, and the team busied themselves with routine measurements and observations. Then, at approximately 1:15 in the morning, Rashid noticed something odd. A car approaching from the Kuala Lumpur side slowed dramatically as it neared the tunnel entrance, dropping from the speed limit of 90 kilometers per hour to barely 40. The driver seemed hesitant, almost reluctant to enter the tunnel. Rashid watched as the car crept forward, and then, just as it crossed the threshold into the tunnel, it suddenly accelerated hard, tires squealing, as if the driver was desperate to get through as quickly as possible. The car vanished around the curve deeper in the tunnel, and seconds later, Rashid heard the screech of brakes and a muffled impact. He ran toward the sound, radioing his team, and found the car had collided with the right-hand wall about halfway through the tunnel. The damage was moderate, not life-threatening, but the driver was in a state of complete hysteria. She was a woman in her 30s, and she was screaming that there had been a child, that she'd tried to stop, that the child had been standing right in front of her car. Rashid and his team searched the tunnel thoroughly. There was no child, no evidence of any pedestrian, no blood or tissue on the vehicle. The woman's dashcam showed the same pattern as Hamza's footage: an empty road, then suddenly a figure appearing directly ahead, then the desperate attempt to brake. The figure in this video was identical to the others, a child in school clothes, standing motionless, staring directly at the camera. When Rashid showed the footage to Priya, her face went pale. She'd been inside the tunnel when this happened, positioned at the midpoint, and she'd seen nothing. No child, no figure, nothing but the car approaching and then suddenly braking. Whatever was appearing on these dash cams wasn't visible to the naked eye, or at least not to everyone. It was showing up on camera, affecting drivers, causing real and fatal accidents, but it existed in some space between physical reality and recorded image. The investigation took a darker turn when Rashid began researching the tunnel's construction history. Karak Highway was built in stages during the 1970s and early 1980s, with Tunnel 13 completed in 1981. The project had been relatively smooth, with no major accidents or delays reported in the official records. But Rashid found something in the local newspaper archives that had never made it into the government files. In September 1980, during the final excavation phase for the tunnel, a small village on the mountainside above was evacuated due to blasting concerns. The village had been home to about 30 families, mostly Orang Asli indigenous people who had lived in the area for generations. They were promised relocation assistance and compensation, but according to follow-up articles, many families struggled to adapt to their new locations, and some simply disappeared from official records entirely. One article, buried in the back pages of a regional paper, mentioned a protest by the villagers before the evacuation. They claimed the mountain was sacred, that the caves and tunnels within it were home to spirits that should not be disturbed. The project supervisor dismissed these concerns as superstition, and the evacuation proceeded on schedule. But there was a footnote, a single line that Rashid almost missed. One child from the village was reported missing during the evacuation and was never located, despite extensive search efforts. Rashid tracked down the child's name from immigration and census records. His name was Danial, and he was 7 years old when he disappeared. The missing person report filed by his parents described him as wearing a white school uniform and dark blue shorts. He had last been seen playing near the edge of the construction site, despite warnings to stay away. Search teams combed the area for weeks but found no trace of him. The case was eventually closed with the assumption that he'd fallen into one of the deep excavation pits or been caught in a rock slide. His body was never recovered, and his parents, devastated and displaced, eventually stopped cooperating with investigators. The timing was impossible to ignore. The tunnel was completed 3 months after Daniel's disappearance, and the first recorded accident involving a child sighting occurred in 2005, roughly 25 years after his death, a significant number in many Asian spiritual traditions. Rashid brought his findings to his superiors at the Royal Malaysia Police and the Ministry of Transport. He expected skepticism, dismissal, perhaps even disciplinary action for wasting time on supernatural speculation. Instead, he encountered something more unsettling: immediate interest and swift classification. Within 48 hours of submitting his report, the investigation was taken over by a different division, one Rashid had never heard of, and all physical evidence, including the dashcam footage, was confiscated. He was told, very firmly but very politely, that his findings had been noted and that appropriate measures would be taken to address the safety concerns on Karak Highway. He was also told, less politely, that discussing his investigation with media or members of the public would result in immediate termination and possible legal consequences under the Official Secrets Act. The Ministry of Transport released a public statement acknowledging optical anomalies recorded on Karak Highway and attributing them to environmental light refraction combined with driver fatigue. They announced a series of road improvements, including enhanced lighting in Tunnel 13, additional warning signs, and a lower speed limit approaching the tunnel. They made no mention of the child figure, the missing boy Daniel, or the spiritual concerns raised by the displaced villagers. But the improvements, when implemented, seemed designed with a different purpose than mere traffic safety. Rashid noticed that the new lighting in the tunnel included a specific spectrum of LED bulbs, different from standard highway lighting. The warning signs approaching the tunnel featured unusual symbols alongside the standard traffic warnings, geometric patterns that Rashid recognized from his research as protective wards used in indigenous Malaysian spiritual practices. Most tellingly, a small shrine was erected just outside the tunnel entrance, ostensibly as a memorial for traffic accident victims, but positioned and oriented in a way that suggested its real purpose was appeasement. The government was taking the spiritual aspects seriously, even if they'd never admit it publicly. The accident rate in Tunnel 13 decreased after these measures were implemented, but it didn't stop entirely. Rashid monitored reports unofficially, using contacts in other departments, and found that crashes still occurred, though less frequently, about once every 6 months, instead of multiple times per month. The pattern of dashcam sightings continued as well, with new footage occasionally surfacing online before being quickly removed and suppressed. Rashid developed a theory, one he could never prove or officially pursue, but which explained the facts as he understood them. Daniel's death had been traumatic and unjust, a child killed by industrial progress and then forgotten. his body entombed in the very structure that had displaced his community. His spirit, unable to rest, had become bound to the tunnel, manifesting in a way that modern technology could capture, but human eyes often missed. The accidents weren't random. They were attempts at communication, desperate efforts to be seen, to be acknowledged, to have his existence and death recognized. The protective measures implemented by the government weren't solving the problem. They were simply suppressing the symptoms, pushing the manifestation into a lower frequency, but not addressing the underlying cause. Rashid believed the only real solution would be to properly acknowledge what had happened, to perform appropriate funeral rites, to honor Danial's memory and the displacement of his community. But that would require the government to admit they'd ignored indigenous concerns, that they'd covered up a child's death, that they'd built a major piece of infrastructure on top of a tragedy. It would open them to liability, criticism, and demands for redress that would be politically and financially costly. So instead, they did what governments often do. They managed the problem, contained it, classified it, and hoped that time and suppression would make it fade from public consciousness. For Rashid, the case became a personal burden. He'd seen too much, understood too much, and been warned too explicitly to ever speak freely about it. But silence felt like complicity, like he was allowing the injustice to continue by refusing to challenge the official narrative. He started experiencing his own encounters, not in the tunnel itself, but in his dreams. He would see Danial standing at the foot of his bed, motionless, mouth moving silently, and he'd wake up with an overwhelming sense of guilt and responsibility. His wife noticed the change in him, the way he'd become withdrawn and obsessive, and she begged him to let it go, to move on to other cases. But Rashid couldn't. He'd made eye contact with the truth, and now it followed him, just like it followed the survivors of Tunnel 13 crashes. In 2015, Rashid took early retirement from the police force, citing health reasons. He moved to a small town in the southern part of Malaysia, far from the Karak highway, and tried to build a quiet life. But he continued to collect information, to monitor reports, to document every new incident involving Tunnel 13. He kept extensive files, digital and physical, and he made arrangements for these files to be released to journalists and researchers in the event of his death. It was his way of ensuring that Danial's story wouldn't be completely buried, that someday someone might have the courage or the power to do what needed to be done. The tunnel remains in active use today, carrying thousands of vehicles every week between the capital and the coast. The official position of the Malaysian government is that any accidents in the area are the result of driver error and normal traffic hazards. The dashcam footage classified as optical anomalies has never been publicly released, though copies circulate in certain online communities, analyzed and debated by people who understand that official explanations often serve to obscure rather than illuminate. Drivers who regularly use the highway have developed their own rituals and precautions. Some throw coins out their windows as they pass through the tunnel, a traditional offering to appease spirits. Others recite prayers or play specific types of music. Many simply drive as fast as legally possible through that section, minimizing their time in the space where Danial waits. And he does wait, appearing on dashcams with decreasing frequency but undiminished clarity, a child frozen in the moment of his death, trying desperately to tell a story that no one with power wants to hear. Rashid knows that someday the suppression will fail. Someday, the accumulated weight of evidence, the growing number of witnesses, the evolution of technology that makes it harder to confiscate and classify every piece of footage will force a public reckoning. But until that day comes, Tunnel 13 remains what it's always been, a passage through darkness, where the dead wait patiently for acknowledgement, and where every driver carries a small piece of Malaysia's unacknowledged guilt through the mountain and back into the light of day. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The tales we've explored so far reveal a disturbing truth about Asia's haunted places, that they're often the product of human actions, tragedies left unresolved, and spirits unable to rest. But what lies ahead takes us even deeper into this darkness, where the supernatural intersects with modern life in ways that are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. In the next part, we'll uncover another location where the government's silence speaks louder than any official statement ever could, where horror isn't just history, but an ongoing presence that refuses to be forgotten. In Hong Kong, where space is precious and history layers upon itself in vertical density, there are buildings that refuse to be reclaimed. Nam Kwu Terrace in Wan Chai stands as one such place, a colonial mansion that has defeated every attempt at renovation, sale, or demolition through means that defy rational explanation. In 2003, a property inspector named Margaret Leung was contracted to assess the building's condition for potential buyers, and what she discovered would force the Hong Kong government to add the property to a classification that officially doesn't exist, a list of structures deemed unsafe, not because of structural failure, but because of documented supernatural activity that poses genuine threat to human life. Margaret had worked in property inspection for 15 years, specializing in heritage buildings throughout Hong Kong's most expensive districts. She'd evaluated dozens of colonial-era structures, many with their own ghost stories and local legends, and she'd never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by foundation settling, water damage, or the creative imagination of superstitious neighbors. Nam Kwu Terrace was different from the moment she approached it. The building sat on a steep hillside in Wan Chai, a massive 3-story structure built in 1,915 inches, the neoclassical style favored by wealthy British colonials. It had been a private residence originally, then a brothel during the Japanese occupation, then abandoned entirely after the war ended. The property had changed hands multiple times over the decades, with each new owner announcing ambitious renovation plans that mysteriously stalled before any real work could begin. By 2003, it had been empty for over 40 years, surrounded by modern high-rises that had sprung up around it like the city's attempt to contain it through urban development. The contrast was jarring. Gleaming glass towers on all sides, and in the middle, this decaying mansion with its overgrown gardens and broken windows, a piece of colonial history that Hong Kong had tried and failed to digest. Margaret's assignment was straightforward on paper: document the structural condition, assess renovation costs, identify any safety hazards, and provide recommendations for either restoration or demolition. The property developers who'd hired her were confident that Nam Kwu Terrace could be converted into luxury apartments or a boutique hotel, taking advantage of its historical character and central location. They'd already received preliminary approval from the buildings department, and they were eager to begin work before property values in the area increased further. Margaret scheduled her inspection for a Tuesday morning in October, arriving with her usual equipment: camera, measuring tools, structural sensors, and a digital voice recorder for notes. The front gate was chained but not locked, and she pushed it open easily. The garden was a jungle of overgrown plants and crumbling pathways, and as she walked toward the main entrance, she noticed something odd about the vegetation. Everything growing here was thorny, aggressive, the kind of plants that discouraged touch and intrusion. Bougainvillea covered the lower walls in thick tangles, and wild rose bushes blocked several windows entirely. It looked less like natural overgrowth and more like the building had grown its own defenses. The front door was secured with a modern padlock, but the wood around it had rotted enough that Margaret could simply push the door open with moderate pressure. The smell that emerged was overwhelming. Not the typical mustiness of an abandoned building, but something organic and rotten, like meat left in a closed space for months. She tied a cloth around her nose and mouth and entered the main hall. The interior was surprisingly intact given the decades of abandonment. The floor was tiled in a black and white checkerboard pattern, mostly undamaged except for a few cracked sections. A grand staircase led to the upper floors, and though the wooden banister was covered in dust and cobwebs, the structure appeared solid. Doorways on either side of the hall led to what had been sitting rooms and dining areas, still containing remnants of furniture covered in heavy layers of dust. Margaret began her documentation systematically, starting with the ground floor, photographing each room, testing floor stability, checking walls for cracks or water damage. The building was in better condition than she'd expected, certainly salvageable with appropriate investment. But as she worked, she became aware of a persistent sound, a low rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the floor above. She paused her work and listened. The tapping was regular, like someone knocking on wood or walking with a cane, and it moved across the ceiling in a pattern that suggested someone pacing back and forth in the room directly above her. Margaret called out, identifying herself as a property inspector, thinking perhaps a squatter or security guard was present. No one answered, but the tapping stopped immediately. She waited for several minutes in silence, then resumed her work. The moment she started taking photographs again, the tapping resumed, louder now, more insistent. She decided to investigate the second floor immediately, rather than completing the ground floor first. As she climbed the stairs, she noticed that the dust on the steps was undisturbed, except for her own footprints. No one had walked here recently, certainly not frequently enough to create the pacing sounds she'd heard. The second-floor hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors on both sides, bedrooms from the original residential period. The tapping had stopped again, and the silence felt oppressive, anticipatory. Margaret opened the first door on her right and found a small bedroom, empty except for a metal bed frame pushed against the far wall. The window was broken, and birds had clearly nested in the room, their droppings covering the floor and sill. Nothing unusual. She moved to the next room and found similar abandonment, decay without purpose or pattern. But the third room was different. The door resisted when she tried to open it, not locked but stuck, as if the wood had swollen in the frame. She pushed harder, and it finally gave way with a crack that echoed through the empty building. The room beyond was dark, despite the morning light outside, the windows covered with something that looked like black paint or tar from the inside. As Margaret's eyes adjusted, she realized the room wasn't empty. The walls were covered in writing, floor to ceiling. Thousands of characters carved directly into the plaster in lines so tightly packed they formed a solid surface of text. She stepped closer and ran her flashlight across the nearest section. The writing was in traditional Chinese old-style characters that predated the simplifications introduced in mainland China. Margaret's Cantonese was fluent, but her reading skills were limited, and many of these characters were archaic or written in a style she didn't recognize. But she could make out enough to understand the general content. They were names, hundreds of names, each one followed by a date and a number. She photographed several sections, planning to have them translated later, and then noticed something that made her stomach tighten. The dates ranged from 1937 to 1945, the period of Japanese occupation, and the numbers following each name were small, between 10 and 16 ages. These were the names and ages of children, or perhaps young women, and the sheer number of them suggested this wasn't a memorial or a tribute. It was a record, a catalog of something horrific. Margaret backed out of the room quickly, her professional detachment cracking. She'd read about Namku Terrace's history as a brothel during the occupation, but the academic knowledge of wartime atrocities was very different from standing in a room that had clearly documented them in obsessive detail. She decided to complete her inspection quickly and file a preliminary report recommending that the property be turned over to historians before any renovation began. But as she turned toward the stairs, she heard something new, not tapping but voices, faint and distant, coming from the floor above. They were speaking Japanese, she was certain of that, though she couldn't understand the words. And underneath the voices, there was another sound, softer and more terrible, the sound of someone crying, muffled and hopeless. Margaret should have left immediately. Every instinct screamed at her to walk out of the building and never return. But professional obligation and morbid curiosity drove her forward, up the stairs to the third floor, toward sounds that shouldn't exist in an empty building. The third floor was smaller than the lower levels, just 3 large rooms that had been used as servants' quarters or storage. The crying was louder here, clearly coming from the room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and Margaret could see flickering light inside, orange and unsteady like candlelight or fire. She approached slowly, her camera held up defensively as if documentation could protect her from whatever waited ahead. She pushed the door open wider and saw a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The room was full of women, dozens of them, dressed in the plain clothing of wartime civilians. Chinese women with hollow faces and vacant eyes. They stood in rows, perfectly still, and in front of them, a man in a Japanese military uniform was speaking, his back to Margaret, his voice the source of the Japanese she'd heard. The crying came from a girl at the front of the group. She couldn't have been more than 14, and as Margaret watched in frozen horror, the soldier reached out and grabbed the girl's arm, dragging her toward a doorway at the back of the room. The girl screamed, a sound of pure terror and despair, and the other women remained motionless, unseeing, as if they'd witnessed this scene countless times and had retreated so far into themselves that nothing could reach them anymore. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly she dropped her camera. The clatter broke whatever spell held the scene in place, and suddenly everything changed. The soldier turned, and Margaret saw that his face was burned, blackened, and melted as if he'd been caught in an explosion or fire. The women's faces turned toward her as well, and they were burned too, all of them, their skin blistered and weeping, their eyes clouded with smoke damage. The girl who'd been screaming was suddenly standing right in front of Margaret, close enough to touch, and her face was the worst of all, beautiful and young but destroyed by flames, her mouth still open in that endless scream. Margaret ran. She doesn't remember making the decision, only the sensation of her legs moving, her lungs burning, her mind refusing to process what she'd seen. She flew down the stairs, through the main hall, out the front door and into the overgrown garden. She kept running until she reached the street, and only then did she allow herself to stop and look back at the building. From the outside, Namku Terrace looked exactly as it had when she'd arrived. Abandoned, quiet, just an old building. But in the third-floor window, barely visible through the dirty glass, Margaret saw a figure. It was the girl, standing motionless, her burned face pressed against the window, watching Margaret with an expression that might have been pleading or might have been warning. Margaret went directly to the police station in Wan Chai and filed a report. She was coherent, professional, and insisted that she was neither drunk nor suffering from any medical episode. She described what she'd seen in clinical detail and provided the photographs she'd taken before dropping her camera. The officer who took her statement was sympathetic but skeptical, and he made it clear that seeing ghosts wasn't a police matter unless there was evidence of squatters or trespassing. But he did follow up, primarily because Margaret was a licensed professional, and her statement implicated a property in the middle of a major development zone. 2 officers returned to Namku Terrace that afternoon with Margaret to verify her claims. They found no evidence of recent occupation. No candles, no furniture, nothing to suggest anyone had been in the building recently except Margaret herself. The room on the 3rd floor was empty and bare, with no signs of the women or the soldiers she'd described. The walls were blank plaster, no writing, no names, no dates. The officers took photographs and filed their own report, noting that the building appeared structurally unsafe and should remain secured pending proper inspection. They made no mention of Margaret's supernatural claims in the official record, but one of the officers, an older man named Chen, pulled her aside before they left. He told her that Namku Terrace had a reputation, that over the years multiple people had reported similar experiences, figures in windows, screams from inside the building, visions of burned bodies. Most notably, in 1998, a group of teenagers had broken into the property on a dare and fled within minutes, claiming a woman's burning face had appeared at a 3rd-floor window. The incident had been covered by local news and investigated by police, who found nothing but were sufficiently disturbed by the teenagers' genuine terror that they recommended the property be officially classified as unsafe and kept off-limits to the public. Officer Chen explained that the buildings department had a classification system that wasn't widely publicized, a category for structures deemed hazardous not because of structural failure, but because of documented effects on human psychology and behavior. Namku Terrace was on that list, and Margaret's experience would be added to the file, but nothing would be made public. The property developers would be quietly discouraged from proceeding. The sale would fall through for mysterious reasons, and the building would remain abandoned for another few decades until everyone currently aware of its history had retired or died. Margaret tried to have the writing in the 2nd-floor room verified independently. She still had several photographs of the carved names and dates, and she brought them to a historian at Hong Kong University who specialized in the Japanese occupation. The historian examined the photographs carefully and confirmed that the names appeared to be authentic, that they matched records of women and girls known to have been held in comfort stations during the war. But when he tried to trace the specific location where these names had been recorded, he found no historical documentation linking Namku Terrace to comfort station operations. The official records showed it had been used as a residence for a single Japanese officer and his family, and while that officer had been investigated for war crimes after Japan's surrender, the charges were dismissed for lack of evidence. The historian suggested that the writing Margaret had photographed might have been added later, perhaps by survivors or activists trying to memorialize victims, but that didn't explain why the room had been completely bare when police inspected it just hours after Margaret's visit. It also didn't explain the visions, the soldier, the women, the burning faces. The historian admitted he had no answers, and gently suggested that Margaret might benefit from speaking with someone who specialized in trauma processing. But Margaret knew what she'd seen wasn't a hallucination or trauma response. It was memory, the building's memory, preserved in stone and wood, and replayed for anyone who entered with enough sensitivity to perceive it. She filed her official inspection report, recommending that Namku Terrace be preserved as a historical site and that any renovation or demolition be preceded by extensive historical research and appropriate memorial ceremonies. She noted the evidence of wartime activity and suggested that the site might contain remains or artifacts of historical significance. She made no mention of ghosts or supernatural phenomena in the official document, but she attached her police statement and the photographs of the carved names as supporting documentation. The property developers withdrew their offer within a week, citing unexpected financial difficulties. The Hong Kong government acquired the property through a complicated series of transactions and added it to the official historical buildings list, but with a caveat that it was structurally unsafe and off-limits to the public. No explanation was given for why a building deemed structurally unsafe wasn't simply demolished, and no timeline was provided for when or if it would ever be opened for historical tours or research. The building remains standing today, still surrounded by modern towers, still overgrown and abandoned. The official classification is Grade 1 historic building, but access requires special permits that are almost never granted. When pressed, buildings department officials cite safety concerns, unstable foundations, potential asbestos contamination, reasons that sound plausible but don't quite explain the level of restriction. Margaret knows the truth, and so do the other inspectors, contractors, and officials who've had their own encounters over the years. The building is locked not to keep people out, but to keep something in. The memories of atrocities that refuse to fade, the spirits of women who died in terror and pain and were never properly mourned or acknowledged. The story of Nam Kwu Terrace raises uncomfortable questions about Hong Kong's relationship with its wartime past. The city has numerous memorials and museums dedicated to the occupation period, but they tend to focus on broad historical narratives rather than specific atrocities. Comfort stations are mentioned in passing, if at all, and the women who suffered in them remain largely unnamed and unremembered in official histories. Nam Kwu Terrace suggests that this silence has consequences, that unacknowledged trauma doesn't disappear, but instead embeds itself in physical spaces, waiting for recognition. The government's solution has been containment rather than confrontation. They've effectively removed the building from public consciousness by restricting access and providing no explanation for its continued preservation. Most Hong Kong residents aren't aware it exists, and those who are know it only as a beautiful old mansion that's mysteriously off-limits. The supernatural reputation circulates in online forums and ghost story collections, but without official confirmation or serious investigation, it remains in the realm of urban legend. Margaret left the property inspection industry entirely after her experience at Nam Kwu Terrace. She retrained as a trauma counselor and now works with survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking. She doesn't talk about what she saw in that third-floor room, but her work is clearly influenced by it, by the understanding that trauma can be transgenerational, that suffering can outlive the people who experienced it and imprint itself on places and communities. She still has nightmares occasionally, always the same image, the girl's burned face pressed against the window, watching, waiting for someone to finally see her, not as a ghost or a horror, but as a victim who deserves recognition, justice, and peace. The building stands, the government maintains its silence, and the women remain trapped in their endless replay of trauma, visible only to those who look closely enough to see past the official narrative of historical preservation and structural safety. Nam Kwu Terrace is a warning written in architecture, a reminder that some debts can't be paid through silence and containment, that the dead will always find ways to make themselves heard, and that no amount of modern development can erase the past if we refuse to properly acknowledge what happened in the shadows of our cities. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.